Hi and welcome to a British Audiophile. If you don't know me already, my name is Taryn. Now today is going to be an interesting day because my objectivity is going to be put into question, and quite reasonably so. I'm going to be reviewing the new exposure amplifier, the recently launched 2510. Now the reason my objectivity is going to be put into question is that those of you who are regular viewers of this channel will know I've owned exposure amplifiers for the last 22-23 years. I have the 21 Pre and the 18 Super monoblocks. Naturally, I'm quite fond of those amplifiers, but if I was rationally and objectively reviewing those amplifiers today, they'd get a highly recommended. They do certain things exceptionally well, and they have a couple of areas for improvement. Now, the danger is that if I favorably review another exposure amplifier, there's going to be an element of people out there who are going to assume that I either have some association with the brand or that I'm just an exposure fanboy, and that isn't the case, but ultimately I'll have to let you be the judge of that.
The exposure 2510 is 440mm wide, 300mm deep and 90mm high. It weighs in at 6 kilograms and is rated at 75 watts into 8 ohms. It's available in the black finish but also in a silver finish. It retails for £1,590 here in the UK. Now it may not be as substantially built as the Sugden amplifier I recently reviewed on this channel, but there's no cheap plastic here. The case is a sheet of folded aluminium. The front plate is 6mm of anodized aluminium and the buttons and the dials are aluminium as well. This is a purist piece. Controls are limited to just a power button, a motorized volume control that has a nice weighty feel, and an input selector dial. When you rotate that dial, there's a reassuring click caused by the input relays switching as you move from one input to the next. The supplied remote control is nothing special, but it can be used to control other exposure devices. On the rear, you have connections for the inbuilt moving magnet phono stage, 4 RCA line level inputs labeled tuner, CD, auxiliary 2 and AV. There's a tape loop and pre-outs to connect to an external power amp or to active subwoofers. Exposure don't use the conventional 5-way speaker binding posts. Instead, they use banana plug sockets for the simple reason that they believe they sound better. Now that may well be the case, but it does mean that you're restricted to using that type of connection with this amplifier. Finally, there's a fused IEC power inlet socket. So let's take a look inside. What you can see here is essentially Exposure's design philosophy, which is to keep things as simple as possible by using as few components as possible and picking components that are as good quality as you can get away with at this price. Now that green large PCB board, that's actually built in Malaysia. Exposure is now funded by the Malaysians, so it probably makes sense to have the board built out there. It's then shipped to the UK, where these amplifiers are hand assembled in Exposure's Sussex workshop. Taking a look at individual components, on the right hand side here we have a custom 200 VA toroidal transformer by Norwegian company Noratel. Those two large power supply filter caps that you can see, those are by European manufacturer Fendiel. There's 10,000 microfarads per channel, which is nothing exceptional, but I should imagine they're fairly decent quality caps. Adjacent to those are the power amplifier modules, lots of discrete components. That's one for that channel. There's an identical one for the other channel. And those cylindrical objects that you can see, those are electrolytic caps by company Elna. They're again top quality electrolytic caps. And essentially what you have here is a power amplifier with a passive preamplifier, which basically means that you've got a volume control and input switching, but no gain, no buffer stage on the preamplifier. That's quite a sensible approach for a relatively modestly powered amplifier, because you've got plenty of open loop gain to play with to get the distortion down and the amplifier's performance linear, and you don't necessarily need the gain on the preamplifier stage. And by doing it this way, you keep the components down to a minimum and the signal path as short as possible. So the passive preamplifier section is here, and you have an Alps Blue Velvet motorized potentiometer. Now, as far as these type of volume controls go, that's pretty much the gold standard. It's a very expensive part. So well done there. And this particular amplifier, unlike the predecessor, has an inbuilt phono stage, and that's what you can see there. The inbuilt phono stage, it's moving magnet. Again, lots of Elna caps. And here next to all the inputs are the input switching relays. So I said it's a passive preamplifier with input switching and a potentiometer. So that's the input switching relays that you have there. Now what you can't see, and I'll show you by going round, are the output devices. Now they're actually mounted underneath the PCP onto a piece of aluminium, which is in turn mounted onto the chassis. By doing it that way, you can effectively use the chassis as a heatsink. It's quite a smart way of doing things. Now there are 4 output devices. They're Toshiba bipolar high current devices. There's 2 per channel. Back out here you can see the whole design, and you can see it's nicely laid out. It's a well thought out design, and it's quite serviceable from a longevity point of view should something go wrong later down the line.
Now, when it comes to talking about sound quality, my reviews are always comparison based, and for a reason. I think it's meaningless talking about sound quality unless you've got some common reference points. Now, in this particular case, I've got a very common reference point in the Hegel H95 that I recently reviewed. That amplifier retails here in the UK for £1,500. The Exposure 2510 is a touch more at £1,590. They may seem like direct competitors, but I don't think they really are. What you've got to take into account is the Hegel H95 is a fully featured amplifier with a built-in headphone amplifier, a very good DAC and a streaming module. The Exposure is essentially a power amplifier with some added features, an input selector, a volume control and a phono stage, and it shows. I think you really have to step up to the Hegel H120 to get something comparable to the amplifier quality of the Exposure. Switching between the two, you notice that the Exposure is just cleaner in its delivery. The leading edges of notes are just more cleanly defined, decay structures are more apparent, and it's the background to the music that is just darker, quieter, so little details, little nuances are just more apparent. It also translates into a little bit more soundstage depth. The Exposure is also a touch more dynamic than the Hegel. There's certainly more mid-bass punch. Now I'll put this down to the output devices in the Exposure. I think those Toshiba devices are just capable of delivering a little bit more current. In terms of overall bass speed or agility, there's nothing to choose between the two amplifiers, and it's a similar case in terms of soundstage width. But this is where both of these amplifiers reveal their price. Stepping up to something like my Hegel H160, the scale of the sound improves quite a bit. There's more soundstage width, there's more soundstage depth, but the speed and control of the bass is the most noticeable improvement. Where my Hegel H160 can't compete with either of these two amplifiers is in overall tonal neutrality. The H160 is definitely a touch on the lean, dry or analytical side of neutral. To tell you the truth, my Exposure 21 Pre and 18 monoblocks can't compete with either of these amplifiers in overall tonal neutrality either. They're distinctly on the warm side of neutral. So remarkable quality of the Hegel H95 and the Exposure 2510. Whatever speakers you combine with these amplifiers, the nature of those speakers are revealed. And if you've got fairly neutral sounding speakers, ultimately it's the nature of the music and the recording that's revealed. Now, if you put a gun to my head, I'd say that the Exposure is a touch more warmer in its presentation than the Hegel, but there's very little in it. The other thing that's really good about both of these amplifiers is that they're very good at low listening levels. Again, something that I can't say is true of my Hegel H160. It's ultimately the features and lack of features on the 2510 that's going to determine who this amplifier is for. This is a very purist piece, and it's intended for people who want an amplifier to do just that, amplify the music. There's no built-in headphone amplifier, no built-in DAC, and no built-in streamer. There is a built-in phono stage, a moving magnet one, for turntable users. I didn't test that feature, I don't have a turntable, so I'm leaving that for another reviewer at another time. But knowing exposure, I bet it sounds fairly decent. I would have liked to have seen the phono stage as a modular option as it was on the previous model, the 2010. That would have brought the price of this amplifier down to a more accessible point for people who don't intend to use it with turntables. I'd have also liked to have seen the DAC as a modular option as it is on the next amplifier up in exposure's range, the 3010 S2D I think it's called. But I understand why Exposure haven't done that. That option would have pushed the price of this amplifier up much closer to the price of the 3010. I suspect that the 2510 is going to pair well with a wide variety of speakers due to its neutral sonic nature. It's also got plenty of real usable power on tap to drive all but the most trickiest speakers. So unless you've got a really difficult speaker to drive or you listen at really loud levels in a large room, I think you're going to be absolutely fine. I tried it with a whole bunch of speakers, and in each case I felt it was the nature of the speaker that was revealed, and remarkably so. I started with the Buchardt S400s that I had in for comparison purposes to do the review on the Buchardt A500s, and the warm, lush nature of the Buchardt S400s was clearly on show, as was the bass weight and extension that speaker is known for. I also tried it with the Amphion Argon 1s, again a speaker that I've recently reviewed on this channel. The Amphion Argon 1s are an extremely transparent speaker with a slightly analytical nature, and again those characteristics were clearly present when I combined it with this amplifier. I also tried it with my long-term reference, the ProAc Response 1SEs. Now that's a tricky speaker to drive, or it can be, and I felt that the Exposure 2510 fared a little bit better than the Hegel H95. Okay, neither of these amplifiers were capable of controlling the ProAcs as well as my Hegel H160, but that's an amplifier at a different price point, so that's to be expected. Now the ProAc Response 1SEs are capable of revealing some very fine textures, details, nuanced, get my teeth in, nuanced information in the mid-range if partnered with equipment that's capable of delivering it. And the Exposure 2510 did this remarkably well, way beyond what I'd expect from an amplifier at this price. So it was really impressive. The final combination that I tried was the speakers that you see behind me. They're not a pair of Klipsch or JBLs. They're actually, let me get this right, Ellipson Heritage XLS 15s. These manufacturers really do need to work on their names. So that was an interesting combination. I'll reveal more about that when I do the review of those, which should be coming out shortly. Before I wrap things up, I just want to share with you how I arrive at my conclusions with my reviews. I have 3 tiers: recommended, highly recommended, and outstanding, for products I consider are good, very good, and excellent within their market segment. Now there's always a degree of subjectivity to any review. If you're not sure about that, pick a single product and go and watch or read half a dozen reviews on that single product. Sure, you'll find some common ground. There's also going to be a whole bunch of contradictions, and that's because human beings are fallible. Personal preference and bias always come into account to some extent. I see my role as a reviewer to remove as much of that personal bias and preference as possible, and to listen for objective differences. And it's possible over the years to train your ears to pick up on very subtle objective differences between one product and another. And that's what I hopefully try and convey in my reviews. Ultimately, you'll be the judge of how successful I've been in that effort. So why am I getting into that? It's because I've owned Exposure amplifiers for the last 23 years, and in full disclosure, I spent a summer working at Exposure 23 years ago. Now, shortly after my stint, it changed hands, and I've had nothing to do with the brand for over 20 years, but I'm still laying myself wide open to criticisms of bias when I favorably review one of their products. And It would have been convenient if I had found this product to be a recommended or a highly recommended, but this is comfortably, objectively and demonstrably the finest sounding amplifier I've heard around this price. Yes, there's amplifiers with more features, but this channel places more emphasis on sound quality than it does on convenience. And the Exposure 2510 gets an outstanding from this channel. Now, just before I do my usual outro, I just want to share with you one of my demo test tracks that I use for envelopment and also for dynamics. The track's by Ghost Rider and it's called Soul Recover, and it has an immensely wide soundstage. In fact, they've done some interesting things with the phase, and at times, even on a 2-channel setup, it sounds like the music's coming sideways. Now, as long as your system is revealing enough and you've got your speakers set up correctly, you should be able to reveal that characteristic. So it'd be interesting to see how you get on. I'll put a link in the description notes. Just click on that link. It will bring up a YouTube video. Of course, it will sound better if you can access it on a streaming platform or on a CD. So that's it for today. Hopefully you've liked this review. If you have, hit that like button. Please share this review as well. And if you like what I'm doing with this channel, please think about subscribing. But for today, for now, British Audiophile, signing off.